I am on it. Okay, so we finished off with homeostasis, which is a good place to start and stop. So these are some functions of life we went through. So we'll just kind of walk through some of those. We're going to talk a lot about the plasma membrane of cells. It's a very fluid mosaic model. It's very dynamic and it's selectively permeable. So it's very choosy on what it allows in and out. So back to those molecules, we talked about lipids and proteins and carbohydrates. And lipids, of course, are lipid soluble, and water soluble things like proteins and carbohydrates are not lipid soluble. So you're going to find out that the membrane is mostly lipid and very protective about what it lets in and out. So water soluble molecules have a hard time getting into the membrane easy. Or something like testosterone or estrogen, which are lipids, come in very easily. So movement, we'll talk about a lot of muscular system components and joints, which are called articulations. For locomotion, and a lot can go wrong there. Again, we don't have a lot of time to talk about pathophysiology because there's so much normal physiology you need to learn. We hear this term contractility when it comes to muscles. So remember, muscles, again, not the smartest tissue. All they do is shorten to contract, but they do a lot of work and they need a lot of metabolism. And they really have to function properly, especially the heart muscle. But we're going to talk mostly about skeletal muscle. So responsiveness and the activity of the nervous system, we're going to see. We're going to talk about reflexes, which don't involve voluntary thought for muscle contractions. And they're real preventative mechanisms. Again, just like reproduction, we want to get those genes to the next generation as best we can. So we have to survive to do that. So being responsive to changes are really important. You'll see that when we do feedback mechanisms in a little bit. Digestion. And digestion is not just about breaking down the food, it's about absorbing it. So, and this is a lot of exocrine enzymes that help break down the carbohydrates, break down the proteins and lipids or triglycerides into simpler molecules. So when we do chemistry, you'll learn the simpler molecules, which we already talked about. Carbohydrates in their longest forms are called polysaccharides, and glucose is a monosaccharide. There's also disaccharides like sucrose, the table sugar we use, which is glucose, and fructose, two monosaccharides together. The breakdown products of proteins is amino acids, and the breakdown products of triglycerides is fatty acids. And technically, the breakdown of steroids is cholesterol, because cholesterol is the base molecule for all steroids. So cholesterol, of course, is a lipid. And nucleic acids are broken down to your nucleotides, which is a nitrogenous base, a sugar, and a phosphate, just to get you to hear this now. Metabolism, I told you, it's the sum of all chemical reactions, whether it's catabolic or anabolic. So breakdown like proteins to amino acids is catabolic. Building up proteins like protein synthesis, which happens on the ribosome, is anabolic. Building up proteins like testosterone, estrogen, increase protein synthesis on the ribosome in the cell. Very cool. With RNA, it affects your DNA and affects your RNA, or really affects your RNA, moving from the DNA to the ribosome, bringing those amino acid codes so you could build proteins. So excretion of wastes, and which is metabolism from either digestion, but it's not just that. It's also carbon dioxide from cellular metabolism, because we're using oxygen to make the ATPs, to give the energy to the muscle to contract. And carbon dioxide is one of the byproducts or waste products of muscle metabolism. And you'll learn about urea, which is breakdown of part of breakdown of proteins. Not amino acids, of course, is the product, but urea is kind of the waste product. But we could use this. And of course, urine and feces is digestive excretion. So that's a process, and you don't want those building up. You don't want too much nitrogen. You want too much bacteria in your system. So that's part of the necessities of life, is getting rid of those. Reproduction, like I said, involves a lot of mitosis at times, and meiosis, of course, for your sex cells. So mitosis is somatic cell division. Meiosis is gamete cell division, your sperm and your egg. So there's a lot to do with reproduction. And again, we're not going to talk a lot about reproduction because we don't do the reproductive system in the semester, but you have to know those cells, you have to know those functions. And growth in size, of course, but more than growth, repair. Repair when something goes wrong, when there's a bad protein, when there's a broken bone, or a mutation in your DNA. That's all part of repair. I think that should be part. I think I put this, I'll tell the author, you should put the repair. Growth and repair if you want, but I think repair is important. Our DNA gets broken, mutated, and it's cleaned up right here when we're sitting here for all these hours. The DNA undergoes mutation that could be dangerous, but it's fixed by our body. The processes of metabolism and homeostatic physiology. We're getting attacked by viruses and cancer cells and bacteria all the time. And somehow we don't get sick unless we're out of homeostasis somehow. Okay, so multicellular, we'll learn the tissue types, which break down the cells once we learn the cells. Here's a number for you in case you're on Jeopardy. There's 11 organ systems. And the practical is going to involve this. You're going to have to know the organ system. So we'll talk about them a little more in lab, but let's just breeze through them a little bit. And again, we don't have to memorize this right now, but you can see how the systems work together. Like I mentioned, the red blood cell, which carries oxygen to the tissue, puts it into the mitochondria, and then it makes ATP to work. So of course, the blood cells have to get oxygen from the respiratory system. And then we got to get rid of carbon dioxide from the respiratory system. And then we got to get rid of the fluid and waste from the blood via the urinary system. And then we get all the nutrients that are put into our blood, like our homeostatic levels of calcium, sodium, potassium, amino acids, glucose, fatty acids, all the products we need to go into the blood. And the blood is mostly water, which you're going to see when we do connective tissue. Plasma is the liquid part of that. The cells of the blood, of course, are your red blood cell, white blood cell, and platelets. And then we have excretory functions with urine and feces. So I'm going to kind of breeze through these. I think I actually have a narrated PowerPoint you could listen to help you with the first practical. So it's really simple. There's not a lot of questions, but you should know something basic about each system before we get into a system. And we'll do integumentary system before the first practical. I believe that's the 4th lab, or maybe 5th. So either way, it involves all the tissue. So integument is our skin, hair, and nails. So skin is a protective organ. Integument protects us, our first line of defense. And your hair, as beautiful it is, and you know my hair is beautiful. Hair I have, there's tons of hair on my head, is for protection, maybe from the sun, maybe from particles. Your eyebrows, your eyelashes are all lines of defense. Your tears, which are glandular, which come out from epithelial tissue. Very important. And you're secreting oil as antibacterial, wax from your ears. It's all a line of defense. So of course, you're one of the big things about, and you're going to know this for skeletal system, that the skin can convert chemicals that build vitamin D. So you get vitamin D from the sun through your epidermis, which is the top layer of your skin. It gives you pigment, which is melanin, which is a pigment, a dark brown pigment that protects us from destruction from the sun rays. So integument's got a lot going on. This is the skeletal system. Now, we're going to talk a lot about this, but let me tell you my favorite parts of the skeletal system, functions of the skeletal system. We know that the skeletal system gives us a frame. It gives us room for movement or attachments for muscles to move. It gives us strength. It gives us protection of certain organs, especially our brain and the cranium, our sternum, the chest and ribs for the lungs. It's not a lot of protection around the abdominal area, though. But what I like about the skeletal system is that it makes blood cells. Bone marrow makes blood cells, and that's called hematopoiesis. Now, of course, I'm going to talk about that a lot later, but let's bring it up now. It makes blood cells, I'm telling you, right? And it stores calcium, stores minerals, stores calcium and phosphate, which is another mineral, ion too. So it does both of these. Are my favorite things about bone, making blood cells, especially red blood cells, but it makes all blood cells in the bone marrow. It stores the minerals. Muscular system, of course, one of the things that the muscle system does is actually increase our body temperature when we have muscle contraction. So it maintains our body temperature, which we'll talk about later, not much longer. We'll talk about, our body temperature trying to be maintained at that 98.6 Fahrenheit, which is also 37 degrees Celsius. But of course, muscles move our joints. It moves our joints. It moves our bones. It keeps us moving, which is a big part of life, is movement. Helps us get blood back to our heart, actually, which you're going to see in cardiovascular. So skeletal muscles have to pump. You have to move. And of course, it contracts. And we'll talk a lot about muscle, the muscle system. Nervous system, the first thing I think about is electric. Electric and the actual cell is called a neuron. We'll talk about that. It involves a lot of what's called, and here's a word you're going to have to eventually really live by. It's called depolarization. And of course, we're not going to go into that deeply, but this is excitation. So they have excitable membranes, cellular membranes. And I forgot to mention, muscles also have excitable membranes. But remember I told you that muscles really need the nervous system to contract. So the depolarization of an excitation of nerve cells, like neurons, will depolarize muscle cells, which their membranes are excitable. But the electricity, and when I talk about depolarization of electricity, I'm talking about ions like sodium. So remember this for later. Ions, which is a positively charged ion. And remember I said polarized, like the world, the earth is polarized. It's got two poles. So picture a positive pole and a negative pole, and that's polar. So if you change that polarity, you depolarize it. And sodium has a lot to do with that. So always remember, it's depolarization, sodium, electric nervous system. And what do we got here? Endocrine system, I kind of already talked about. Here we're dealing with hormones and chemical messengers. What a lot of books do, they kind of compare the nervous system with the endocrine system. So the nervous system works very fast and short lasting. Well, the endocrine system is kind of slow release, long lasting. So the nervous system uses chemicals, not hormones, but they're very similar, and they're called neurotransmitters. And really, you're only going to learn a couple that you're going to know really well. You're going to hear a term called acetylcholine or norepinephrine. And those are the two big ones you're going to hear about. Like norepinephrine is basically the same as the hormone adrenaline, which is made from your adrenal glands, like fight or flight. I'm going to talk a lot about sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. I don't even want to go into it too deep now because I'm going to talk about it so much. So all of these glands will release hormones, like the pineal gland releases a hormone called melatonin, which makes you sleepy and controls your sleep-wake cycles. Your pituitary gland is a Disneyland of hormones that are released. There's about 9 hormones that are released from your pituitary gland alone. So I'm going to talk about them kind of slowly, and you'll learn it in A&P too. Thyroid gland, I think I mentioned one called calcitonin. I might have mentioned that before about calcium homeostasis. But if I haven't, I'm going to mention that a lot. And there's also a gland behind that called the parathyroid hormone, which we're going to talk about with calcium homeostasis. It's called the parathyroid gland, sorry, but it releases parathyroid hormone. Thymus is kind of boring in an adult. This is more active in a child, but it has a lot of importance to it, especially with the immune system. Did you ever hear of a T cell? I've heard of them, especially if you've been reading the news about the vaccine. So the T cell, the T actually comes from thymus, because thymus is where T cells mature, but mostly in kids, not so much in adults. In fact, if it's too overactive, it could create like an autoimmune condition, which is a hyperactivity of your T cells against your normal tissue. This is my favorite, the adrenal gland. That's all endocrine. The center of the adrenal gland is called the adrenal medulla, and that's where the adrenaline is made. That's exciting, adrenaline, fight or flight. And it's the same thing as norepinephrine, really. Noradrenaline and norepinephrine are the same. Epinephrine and adrenaline are the same. But I like to say adrenaline is more the hormonal release into the blood than the nervous system, which is more epinephrine. Pancreas, we're going to talk a lot about insulin and glucagon in the AP, but not so much in AP1. But I mentioned blood glucose a lot, and that has to do with insulin, which is made and secreted from the pancreas. Then you have the gonads, the ovary we kind of talked about already, which secretes estrogen and progesterone, where the testes secretes the hormone testosterone, and other androgens, which is what the male hormones are based on. And remember, steroids are all from cholesterol. So that's some things, some general overview of the endocrine system and other systems. Let's see what else we got coming next. Cardiovascular system, again, we don't do that in AP1, but this is a delivery system for oxygen, really. And the heart is a very important pump. And your blood vessels are like roadways to take the blood, the oxygenated blood, to the tissue, every tissue in the body, especially the brain. Because remember, the brain, the nervous system controls everything. The heart kind of has its own nervous system control, conductivity, but the heart still, the nervous system still controls it. So again, we're not doing blood. Blood, of course, carries hormones, and we're also delivering hormones. We're delivering ions like sodium, potassium, calcium, and of course, white blood cells for immunity, and thrombocytes, also known as platelets, for blood clotting, and hemostasis, coagulation, which keeps the blood in the body in case we are injured. So this cardiovascular system, of course, is important, but it works intertwined with other systems like the respiratory system. Lymphatic system, this should really go along with the cardiovascular system. So that the lymphatic system is about reabsorbing excess fluid in the tissue, if you can remember that. I mean, it also carries immune cells, so it has white blood cells. It also carries dietary lipids. But I think for our purposes, when we talk about intracellular fluid and diffusion, and then when you go to cardiovascular, the lymph system will reabsorb any excess fluid that's in between the cells. And there's the thymus gland. Remember that one? That's part of the endocrine system. It's also part of the lymphatic system because of the white blood cell, T cells, which are lymphocytes. So you have vessels, you have ducts, and you have lymph glands too, which are in areas, and lymph nodes. That's important. Like when you learn the body cavities, you learn that this is the inguinal area, which are inguinal lymph nodes. Under the arm is called axillary, so it'd be axillary lymph nodes. Axillary is just a general term for that area underneath the armpit. Inguinal is groin, sometimes called iliac. And up here in the neck, we call that cervical lymph nodes. So when you learn the terminology and the organ systems mixed, it all makes sense. So those are some highlights of the lymph system. The respiratory system is pretty basically, has two functions. One is to bring oxygen into the body, into the blood, and get rid of carbon dioxide. The other is acid-base control. Too much hydrogen ion, too little bicarbonate ion, which we'll learn. That's another ion. Kind of looks like this. This is like a buffer. That's the bicarbonate ion, which we'll talk about in chemistry. So this is more base with a higher pH when you see a lot of this. So if you see a lot of this, it's acid. This is more base or alkaline. This is acid. So the respiratory system has something to do with that. And usually, if you can remember this, the more carbon dioxide you have in your blood, the more acid. So that's one of the reasons we have to get rid of carbon dioxide, to keep the blood homeostatic range. And we'll talk about that in a minute when we get to the feedbacks. Digestive system, I think we're pretty clear here. You know, breaking down the food, using your tongue, using your teeth, using your lips and pharynx, and then your esophagus, which will take the food down involuntary. So there's a lot of smooth muscle in the esophagus, and the contraction of smooth muscle you're going to find out is called peristalsis. You don't need to do that voluntarily. Your body does that automatically, involuntary. So the liver is not a primary organ of digestion, but it aids. Stomach is all about digestion. The small and large intestine are all about reabsorbing things like water and nutrients. So we have to get the nutrients into our system from our food, from Chick-fil-A or wherever we go tonight. And the rectum and the anus is all about storing and excreting. So the rectum stores the waste material in the form of feces, and the anal canal or the anus is where it's excreted. So the alimentary canal starts in the mouth and the oral cavity, ends at the anus. They call it alimentary canal, the digestive system, which you're not doing in the semester. Urinary system, it's all about excreting wastes and filtering blood, really. The kidney is a filter, really important, and excreter and secretor. So it's got a lot of function. The kidney's got a lot of work to do. And it also helps you with acid-base balance by excreting the hydrogen ion or reabsorbing the bicarbonate ion. So the kidney and the respiratory system work in close contact when it comes to acid-base balance. Really important. Reproductive system, again, we don't do that here in this section, right? We don't do that. So I'm not going to talk a lot about it, but of course we're going to talk about the hormones. We're going to talk about how the nervous system affects the reproductive system and so forth and so on, all right, and some of the parts. Female reproductive system, again, this involves the mammary glands. As part of the reproductive, they're activated hormonally. So the endocrine system really works on these two systems between the male and female, especially the female, because this is every month. It's very complicated how these hormones work, and the elevation of estrogen and other hormones that mostly come from the pituitary. Survival needs, and not in this order. Nutrients, of course, oxygen gas, right? Oxygen gas, water, H2O. And the nutrients are basically, you need vitamins, of course, like in small amounts, but in large amounts, you need those amino acids from proteins. You need the glucose, of course, for carbohydrates, and you need the fatty acids from your triglycerides, and you need cholesterol too. You'll find out why you need some cholesterol. Normal body temperature. What's a normal body temperature? 98.6, right? And that's degrees Fahrenheit. And that's like 37 degrees Celsius or centigrade. And the appropriate atmospheric pressure. It's about respiratory. And this really helps your diaphragm take in the air, and you get enough oxygen into your body. Like we're here in Morris County, we're at sea level in New Jersey, and the atmospheric pressure is like 756 millimeters of mercury. But if you go to like Denver, say, where it's higher elevation, then the partial pressure of oxygen especially, but the atmospheric pressure of oxygen is lower. So it's harder to get the oxygen into our red blood cells at higher elevations. Again, we're not going to talk a lot about that, but I will mention it when we talk about bone and how the bone marrow makes red blood cells and increases the making of red blood cells when oxygen is low to try to increase the oxygen carrying capacity. So these are all really important for survival. Water, of course, our universal solvent. All our reactions happen in the presence of water. Okay, this kind of breaks it down a little bit more. And you already memorized these. You can tell me all this, right? And you can even tell me what glucose is now. You know about amino acids. You know about fatty acids. You know about cholesterol, basically what it is. Lipids, right? And we'll talk more about minerals and vitamins, but calcium is a mineral. vitamins are usually cofactors for these reactions to happen. And we're learning more and more about vitamins. I know they're important. We always knew they were important. But maybe some of these vitamin compounds can be used more as medicine. I'm not talking about just some homeopathic guy at the corner. I'm talking about real life-changing ways to produce these vitamins and give them in a way that could kind of take away the use of harmful chemicals that are in a lot of the medications that we take or have to take to sustain life when we're out of homeostasis. Oxygen, again, not just the element oxygen, the gas oxygen, the molecule, not a compound molecule. There's only one element in this one. So again, our body can't survive a few minutes without oxygen. That's true, but it's really because of the brain. If the brain doesn't get oxygen, nothing's going to work. So 10 minutes of the brain without oxygen, and you're on your way to becoming a vegetable, a carrot or something. So brain death. So very important that cardiac output from the cardiovascular system, first and foremost, gets blood to the brain, and every other tissue, every single tissue in the body needs the oxygen. Yeah, we know this. It's the most important chemical. You probably could tell me that's an inorganic chemical. And how many oxygen molecules or atoms are in there? So you need this for your chemical reactions. Pretty much every chemical reaction in our body utilizes water by way of adding water through hydrolysis or removing water through dehydration synthesis. You're going to hear all these words. That's why I'm saying them. Right? And all our secretions, and of course our blood and our tears and the liquid in our eyes, the lymph system, all have a lot of water in their secretions. Now here's about body temperature. 37 degrees Celsius is the same as 98.6. So that's homeostatic. And it can go a couple of points either way, but not too far, right? And we need this appropriate atmospheric pressure for one reason to get the oxygen in, and another reason to get the carbon dioxide out. So here's the word. I think this might be the first time the book mentioned it. I like to talk about it earlier, right? Dynamic state. It kind of is tested by change. So if there's a change in the homeostasis, that's when the body mechanisms have to kick in to maintain homeostasis. And that gives you a state of equilibrium. So it's constantly readjusting body temperature and other things. So I don't want to jump too far, but some of the homeostatic controls, let's just talk about some of them now. Now we mentioned body temperature, right? Body temperature, which should be around 98.6 Fahrenheit, 37 degrees Celsius. What else? Anybody know what else? Please help me out here. Like if you go to the doctor, they do vital signs. What else would they test for besides body temperature?
Blood pressure.
Yeah, blood pressure. So blood pressure is like around, on the average, 120 over 80, 120 systolic over 80 diastolic. I think 80 is a little bit high, but there's a range for blood pressure, homeostatic blood pressure. What else?
Heart rate.
Oxygen saturation.
Yeah, heart rate. Heart rate should be between at rest. Now, all of this is at rest, not after exercising. It's like 60 to 100. So somebody mentioned a really good one. It's your oxygen saturation on hemoglobin. That's really important. And that should be 100%, really. I mean, for at least equal to or greater than 95%. Very good. I like that one. That's a really big one. And this has to do with, how much oxygen pressure is in your blood or how much hemoglobin you have compared to how much oxygen it can carry. So yeah, they'll put that little thing on your finger, and they can test it's called a pulse oximeter, and you can test the percent of hemoglobin that's bound to oxygen. And that should be over 95% of your hemoglobin should be bound. And that's arterial blood though, not vein blood. That's our artery blood, which you'll find out. What else? Those are really great, by the way. And these are all non-invasive tests, right? You don't even have to puncture an artery, really. What else? You can do respiratory rate, which I would say is about 16 to, and by the way, this is beats per minute, 60 to 100. and 16 to 22 breaths per minute. We could do that too. Yeah, that's good. And of course, you know, when we puncture a vein, say, and take blood, what can we get there? That's really important. What's a really important one that could change a lot? Maybe two things.
What was the question again?
Like if we do a blood test, we actually draw the blood. What are some values that are important, that they're in homeostatic range?
Blood sugar?
Yeah, glucose, blood glucose, very good.
Glucose.
Blood glucose, yeah, that's good. So that should be, I think most labs will tell you between 90 and 110 milligrams per deciliter of blood. So yeah, and again, that's fasting usually, and it's at rest. So I think calcium would be another one we need to look at. Blood calcium, important for us. So these are really important for us now. And maybe sodium levels and potassium levels, and then I guess lipid panels too. But I think these are more homeostatically controlled from minute to minute, all these things. I think these all are really good. Way to go. Very, very good. Thanks for that. So you have variables, of course. That's why I said these kind of can change a lot, like your body temperature and your blood volume too. Like blood volume is how much liquid is in your blood, really. And the kidney has some control over that. If we're going to reabsorb water, we're going to let it out, depending on our blood pressure. So basically, blood volume has to do with blood pressure, and may have something to do with dehydration as well. So here are the parts of a control center. Well, not a control center, a homeostatic control, or I like to call them feedback mechanisms. So the first thing you need in the mechanism is a receptor, like a sensor. So the receptor senses a change in homeostasis, like my blood pressure dropping, like my heart rate decreasing, like my blood sugar increasing out of homeostatic range. But it's a change in homeostasis that the receptor senses. And then the receptor sends an input to a control center. And 99% of the time, the control center or the integration center is going to be what? Anybody know? Like a place called the hypothalamus is really important. Medulla oblongata. So basically the brain is most of the time, like for blood sugar, it's not. The blood sugar, we don't need the brain. That just happens in the pancreas. But everything else, like blood pressure, body temperature, blood volume, heart rate, respiratory rate, are controlled by the brain. So that's the control center, which sends an output to something that's going to make the change, like the organ or the muscle. So this could be a muscle, a gland, another organ. And muscle could be any muscle, could be, mostly cardiac muscle, right? But it could be smooth muscle and blood vessels, glands to release water through sweat, and organs, and that are also part of the hormonal system of the endocrine system. So it's really muscles and glands that do most of the work. So muscle includes heart. So these all, and you don't have to memorize these now, just memorize this word. It's called the effector, the one that's going to cause the change or do the work to cause the change, right? So what are we going to use here? What's something? Let's just use. I don't want to use blood sugar right now because that involves the pancreas. Let's use body temperature. So the change is decrease in body temp, blood temperature, right? And that should be 98.6 or 37 degrees Celsius. So the receptor is a thermoreceptor, which sometimes is in the brain, really. So the receptor senses the drop in temperature, sends input to the control center. In this case, it is the brain, like the hypothalamus, which is like the thermostat of our brain, our body. And the output from the brain is going to be to the skeletal muscles to shiver. So shivering, when we shiver when we're cold, is actually skeletal muscle contraction. Because I might have mentioned it before, when your skeletal muscles contract, they give off heat as one of the byproducts, not just carbon dioxide, but they give off heat. So it increases the body temperature. Now, you don't want this output to keep going and going and going to with a body temperature, that's body temperature, blood pressure, body temp. You don't want the body temperature to go up to 102. So this has to be shut off. So the control center knows when to stop it when it gets out of homeostatic range again. So when that happens, when the output is turned off, when it gets to the endpoint of homeostatic range, that's called negative feedback. So I'll tell you this. Almost all these, I think all of these, body temp, blood pressure, heart rate, they're all negative feedback systems. So they won't go out of homeostatic range. And that's what keeps it. Of course, if they do, and they do a lot, especially with blood pressure, a lot of people have hypertension, which is increasing blood pressure at rest all the time. It's not working, right? The feedback mechanism is trying, but it's not working. Probably because we have so many mechanisms in our body naturally that increase your blood pressure. So blood pressure is a good example of a negative feedback as well, and most of them are negative feedback. So the output is stopped and shut off. So the receptor monitors the change in the environment, like, and the stimuli is that change in the controlled variables like blood pressure, heart rate, respiratory rate, could be acid base, too much acid, and so forth, so on. And then the control center, again, is usually the brain, and that determines the ranges of homeostasis. So it receives an input from the receptor, and then the appropriate response is an output to the effector. And the effector is going to be the place that makes the change, right? Which could be a gland, it could be in the heart, could be another part of the nervous system, like or an organ, or smooth muscle. So that's going to do the work to make the change. So eventually it's going to reduce the output and it's negative feedback. Or if it doesn't stop and it goes even stronger change and enhances the output, that's positive feedback. And there's only a couple you need to know. I'll tell you right now, positive feedback happens during childbirth and labor. You might have heard this. So in that case, the stimulus is the stretching of the opening of uterus called the cervix during labor. So the stretch is the stimulus. The receptor is a stretch receptor in the cervix. The control center is the hypothalamus, which is connected to the posterior pituitary. The output is the release of a hormone called oxytocin, and the effector is the uterus to squeeze more. And that doesn't stop. That won't shut off. That'll keep going as long as the stimulus is there, the baby's head and then the placenta. So also breastfeeding, lactation, is a positive feedback. Same hormone too as oxytocin for release. All right, that's another positive feedback. And the other one is blood clotting. That's kind of dangerous, right? It's appropriate to clot the blood, but the positive feedback part of it scares me a little bit because it keeps going. Because our body's very sensitive about losing those precious red blood cells that carry oxygen. So evolution might have not have caught up to us there, where we're actually still clotting too fast, which can lead to cardiovascular disease, right? Just like blood pressure. People tend to have more hypertension, high blood pressure than they do low blood pressure, probably because of the mechanisms have not evolved to now. They're still worried about losing blood back 140,000 years ago, where we were scared, our body was more concerned about losing blood because we were going to get eaten by a dinosaur or a tiger or something, Now, we have the same effect when we're studying for an exam. So it's a different time now, and evolution may not have really caught up to us. So we're constantly battling things like hypertension and blood clots and embolisms and things like that. So this is the most used negative feedback. So if all else fails, it's a negative feedback, Just remember the ones that are positive feedback. So of course, body temperature is a negative feedback. Now, the insulin, blood glucose, insulin is a hormone released by the beta cells of the islets of Langerhans of the pancreas. So when your blood glucose goes up, like if we're at Chick-fil-A and we have a strawberry milkshake, insulin is going to be released from your pancreas to take the glucose out of the blood and put it into the cells so it can be used as for cellular metabolism, ATP. So if the blood glucose is high, insulin is released. If the blood glucose is low, there's another hormone called glucagon that does the opposite. It's kind of antagonistic. But this doesn't involve the brain. This only involves the pancreas. So I don't want to confuse you there. So the pancreas makes that decision, how much glucose is in the blood, and whether I'm going to release insulin or I'm going to release glucagon to control and keep that homeostatic blood glucose level between 90 and 110 milligrams per deciliter of glucose in the blood. So yeah, it's receptors. Pancreas is the control center, right? And I don't know if they mentioned glucagon here, but of course, if their blood sugar levels, blood glucose levels are low, you're definitely not going to release insulin. You're going to release glucagon. We're going to go to our storage because we want homeostatic. It could be too low. Hypoglycemia is low glucose levels. Hyperglycemia is high. So that's a negative feedback. And it's kind of antagonistic with the hormonal release from the pancreas. It's always a confusing thing, this little seesaw, and we see this in every book. But it pretty much tells you, you're in balance, and then there's a out of balance stimulus. And that out of balance stimulus is sensed by the sensor or receptor. And then the input, usually something going into the central nervous system or into a structure is called afferent. So the input goes in any case, or pancreas in one case, but most of the time in the central nervous system to the brain. And the output is something like oxytocin or nerve or hormonal release like oxytocin. And that's going to an effector, which is a gland or a muscle, right? Smooth muscle, cardiac or skeletal muscle. And then that could change the stimulus. So it brings it, back to balance. But it doesn't want to bring it down here because then you'd have to have another feedback mechanism. It wants to just return it to normal, because if it goes here, then this control center has to shut off that output. And that's negative feedback. Positive feedback, you're going to be, this guy on this side of the seesaw is going to be flying in the air, right? So most of those control mechanisms are negative feedback. And you can go through each one. You see a stimulus if this helps you. And receptor to control center, you probably can tell what's next. You're going to get output to the effector. And then you're back to balance. And you don't want to overshoot, because then you got to start again, right? Right? You sweat when it's hot. That's the effector, is your sweat glands. But then if you get too cold, temperature sensitive, receptive, and then you shiver. And hopefully that'll put you back to balance. But if it goes too high, of course, this never happens where you're getting cold, getting hot, but it does with your blood pressure. It does with your heart rate. It can do it with your respiratory rate, and it definitely does it for acid base. And a lot of times with blood sugar. So it can be that quick of a turnaround. So here's the positive feedbacks where everything is enhanced or exacerbated and the output increases. It doesn't stop. It keeps going beyond what could be balanced. So there's not a continuous control. And these are completely appropriate, like labor contractions. Of course, you want to enhance the uterine contractions with oxytocin and for lactation as well. That makes complete sense. And then it'll stop once the stimulus is gone. But this one worries me a little bit because the more signals that are sent out by things like platelets, the more clotting comes in. So clotting is increased. And we do have some mechanisms to break up clots and dissolve some of that insoluble fibrous proteins. But still, this could lead to problems in the arteries, blockages, embolisms, and real dangerous things, especially if you already have a comorbidity like diabetes or respiratory problems. So it's kind of scary. And that could lead to things like stroke or heart attack, which is myocardial infarction, or other cardiovascular diseases. Rock and roll. So this is just showing, this is a very complicated cascade. It's called coagulation from a platelet plug. And it's not just the platelets, there's other clotting factors that are actually involved. So this is supposed to happen when there's an injury, because again, we're so sensitive, our bodies, about losing this blood. So we got to get those platelets. Completely appropriate too. You get the platelets and they release chemicals. They bring in other clotting factors and they try to seal that off. And that's fine. I mean, that's good, but it's a positive feedback. So this little blockage here, if somebody's not healthy or somebody has a genetic predilection to blood clotting, this clot right here can get bigger and it could block this. If this is an artery going to the brain, say, it can cause a stroke. If it's blocking a coronary artery in the heart, it can cause a heart attack. It can break off and go to another place like the lungs. And a broken off clot that travels is called a embolism. So I'm a little worried about that one. So this will go through that clotting cascade very simply. Very simply. It's only talking about platelets, but there are other factors. So that's a positive feedback, right? So if you go out of homeostasis, you're going to wind up with a risk of disease, which is happening right now as we're sitting here. We're constantly going through imbalances back to balance, imbalances back to balances, right? And your body, your mechanisms get overwhelmed a lot. And that's what leads to disease, especially something like cardiovascular disease. Like the immune system, it's completely appropriate what the immune system does. And you don't want to have a suppressed immune system. You don't have a strong immune system, because then the chance of bacteria, virus, parasites causing disease is less if your immune system can take care of them like the army, But sometimes the immune system is overactive and you get something like an autoimmune condition. And in an autoimmune, your immune system will attack normal cells and you get autoimmune conditions like diabetes type 1 possibly can be caused by an autoimmune reaction that destroys the beta cells of the islets of Langerhans in the pancreas. Something like multiple sclerosis can be an autoimmune condition that destroys the covering of neurons and slows down the conduction, electric conduction, depolarization of nerve tissue. And it's a really serious condition, and it's autoimmune. And rheumatoid arthritis, which is destruction of the synovial joints, which you'll learn a lot about, synovial joints and articulation. So an autoimmune condition is kind of dangerous, And there's another term I just want to bring out before we go. It's called inflammation. And this is an everyday immune response. Most of the time if you get stung by a bee, of course you're going to get an inflammation, you get a histamine release. You're going to hear of a cell called macrophage, which is a type of white blood cell in the tissue that increases. But inflammation is completely appropriate at first, but if it continues, it can actually destroy the inner linings of your blood vessels in your heart chambers, and causes pain, can cause inflammation in the brain, can cause early onset Alzheimer's. So inflammation, again, is one of those things we like to have it, but again, evolution may have not caught up where we really have to treat it. We have to take anti-inflammatories like your non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, we call NSAIDs, right? Like Advil, which is ibuprofen, Motrin is ibuprofen, or naproxen, which is Aleve. So they're anti-inflammatories, but every drug has a side effect and can affect different systems and different aspects of homeostasis. It may elevate your sodium. It may eat away at your stomach because it's blocking an enzyme that we need for other things besides inflammation. So inflammation, again, is a really big cause of a lot of problems: heart disease, autoimmune conditions, possibly Alzheimer's, and other pain-related arthritides like psoriatic arthritis, rheumatoid arthritis, gouty arthritis, which is inflammation of the joints, really. Because it's a normal response, but it's overdone. Okay? You guys okay? You still with me? So how you feeling? That's a lot of shit, right? That's a lot of stuff.
I had a question.
Shoot.
What's the homework situation? Like, is it just going to be to study?
Well, you got your hands full studying this stuff, right?
Okay.
So what I'll probably do is give you like practice quizzes, which are just like, I'll use them, to make sure you're keeping up. Okay. So that's like part of participation. And, like I'll tell you to do some practice questions from another book. And then I always like to give you Pearson questions because it helps you prepare for the departmental final. So I'll give you some of them, but believe me, you're going to have your hands full with the study and keeping up. So I'm just going to give you assignments to keep up, What was the question?
Like no discussion boards or?
You could do that. Yeah, you could start one. I could start one. But I think the best thing, if you have time, is to go to the focus sessions on the tight subjects. That'll help you study on your own. So, I mean, I'm happy to have office hours with you again. I don't know if I mentioned that. I do them through Zoom. 30 minutes, I could help you out when we both have time. And I mentioned this a lot. I know, like you guys, again, you have to show up for lab and you have to show up for lecture, but it's really hard to have a full-time job when you're doing this. So see if you could lower your hours and put in like that's when the syllabus says 15 hours a week, it really means it. So you really have to keep going over these PowerPoints and go over the readings. I'll assign a reading.